All right, back with another Big East preview. This time we're looking at the Georgetown Hoyas, and joining me for this one is Patrick Stevens. He covers the Hoyas and all types of other things, contributes to the Washington Post. So really appreciate you joining us, Patrick. Thank you.
Rick, thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's take a look at this Georgetown team. Last year, they go 9-23 overall, 2-18 in Big East play. That was good enough to get the 10th seed in the Big East, and their only wins came over DePaul, of course. They lost 4 of their 5 starters from that group, but they do return their top scorer in Jaden Epps. So let's start here with all of that being said. What is a realistic expectation for this group, and what would mark a successful season for Georgetown this year?
You know, I think that's an interesting question. And after really the last 3 seasons in particular, where I don't think anybody could draw any kind of sense of success from anything that they've done, I think getting better, like being better at the end of the season and having a number of young guys get better as the year goes along, I think qualifies as success here. And, you know, coaches don't like to put victory totals on these things. I'm not sure it's even wise to try to do that at this point. I think simply being competitive at home against good teams would be a good step forward for these guys. I mean, they had a stretch last year, Butler, UConn, and Marquette, 3 home games in a row. Maybe Marquette was the second one of the batch. They lost those 3 home games. Now, granted, there were a couple of road games in there too, but 3 consecutive home games by a combined 84 points. Like, that's just not competitive at all. And so they're kind of in this interesting spot where they've pushed their chips in on going young, which is a choice in an era where you still have all these 5th-year COVID guys, the last year where you have a ton of them. So there are some risks to what this might look like this year. But I think that the key for them is to simply have something of value to take into a following season to build on. And I think for them, you look at it like last year, there's basically 2 guys back from their rotation. So what did they really gain from going through all of that last year? They got Jaden Epps and Drew Fielder, but there's not much else that you take from that. And that was a lot of losing and a lot of ugly losses. I think for them, getting better as the year goes on and having a group of guys that might be back next year. And obviously you don't know in this era whether guys are going to stick around. But I think that's how you define success, is if you can actually get to the end of the year, get to May, and say, well, we actually have a foundation to work with here moving forward.
Yeah, that's right along the lines I was thinking as I was putting this together, of with the struggles they've had the last few seasons and Ed Cooley's contract. You're in a unique situation in that there's really no pressure on Ed Cooley for this season. There's no hot seat. There's nothing like that that's going to exist for him. They're in it for the long haul with Ed Cooley right now, at least as much as a long haul exists in college basketball in this day and age. And it's like, to your point, it's almost just like you just need hope. You just need some hope to sell going forward. And if you have that, I think it'll be a positive result this season.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I think another thing that would help, which is something they didn't do last year, is to win all the non-conference games you're supposed to win, because they lost the second game of the season to Holy Cross, a team that ended up, I think, like 350th or so in KenPom. And it was obviously going to be a rebuilding year for that team to begin with. And then you have that result, and you're like, well, this isn't any different than what you were seeing the previous couple seasons. So I think hope is a good way of putting it. And you look at a guy like a Thomas Sorber, a big man that I think they're very high on, and haven't had a chance to see him in a practice. Like he moves really, really differently than most freshman big men do. Like, it stands out. Like, there's a fluidity there, and like there's a sense of knowing what he's doing, and it stands out. You've got some younger guards that are in play. They added Malik Mack from Harvard, who has 3 years of eligibility left. You know, can they get like 2 or 3 of those guys that you look at and say, these could plausibly be starters on an NCAA tournament team? It's probably not going to be this year, realistically. But maybe if they develop, maybe that's something that is within reach a year from now. But for right now, I think simply putting themselves in a spot where there is some reason to believe things are going to be better, because there was nothing certainly about the last 2 years under Patrick Ewing that suggested things were going to get better. And last year, especially once the calendar turned to 2024, was exceptionally bleak for Georgetown as well. Not a lot of close games in that mix either.
We talked about Jaden Epps returning, and you can argue about whether he's always playing winning basketball or was always efficient basketball, but he is a dangerous scorer and one of the most prolific scorers in the conference returning. Is there an area where you think he might improve this year?
Well, I think the big question is, and it remains to be answered, is now that you've got Malik Mack, now that you theoretically have some other help for him that's potentially consistent. Like, I think Malik Mack, based on what he did at Harvard last year, is probably going to be a pretty good player for Georgetown. I think that they believe Sorber is going to be somebody that people are going to know about by the time Big East play rolls around, and certainly by the time it's complete. If Epps has help that he can trust and is reliable and they think is going to actually show up most games, then maybe he doesn't play the same way that he did last year at times, which was clearly, I'm the only guy that can solve this problem. Let me take my chances. And if I go 6 for 20, well, that was still better than other options. So I think, too, you're talking about having a bunch of younger guys that are probably going to buy into what they want, whatever sort of roles there are. Whereas I think last year, one of the problems that they had is, of course, Ed Cooley gets hired in late March. You only have so much time to throw together a roster. You throw in a bunch of guys that either retaining or finding guys that only have a year of eligibility left. And then you're just kind of stuck with guys that are playing out the string as soon as it becomes clear that it's going to be a bad year. So I think that the question is does Epps embrace the help that's around him? I suspect that he might. I think it's certainly better for him to be able to show that he can play more winning basketball, to kind of, borrow the line there, than what we saw last year, although it's certainly understandable why at times he did sort of take the hero ball / Superman approach, given what Georgetown had around him last season.
It's really well said. That's what I'm maybe most curious about watching this Georgetown team. Because if he could sort of flip that switch and just everything works better around him, he could be a really nice guard in this conference that could be really effective. But it just remains to be seen if he can sort of play better within the system and better with his teammates, I would say. Completely.
And that's, I think, one of the top 3 or 4 questions as to what we're going to take away from even just the first month or so of the season. They play their first 8 games at home until they go to West Virginia in early December. And so there's some time to sort things out and time to kind of get some habits in a good spot. And I think we'll know pretty early, maybe even by that 3rd game against Notre Dame, just where exactly Epps and a few other guys are at this stage of the season.
The only other returner that played at all last year is Drew Fielder. Are they expecting anything out of the 6'11" sophomore?
Well, he's packed on like an extra 20 pounds or so. And so, one of the problems last year was they had no size whatsoever. They had Supreme Cook, the Fairfield transfer, that was just kind of hanging in there and a rugged player. And at times was frankly their most valuable player just because he was a guy that could actually get in there and rebound and actually provide some kind of a presence, even if he was undersized. And Fielder was a guy that in a perfect world, in a well-developed program, would have been a guy that maybe played 8 minutes a game or something like that, and wouldn't have had to play at the 5 at that stage in his career simply because his physical development wasn't at the point where it was fair to him to have to do that. So I think they expect him to be able to help. I don't know if he's suddenly going to be a guy that jumps into, averaging double figures or anything, especially with a guy like Sorber that they're banking on being kind of the main guy in the post, not just for this year, but beyond. But I do think Fielder's a guy that they're going to turn to in the hopes that he can, provide some stability, and certainly is somebody that knows the system better than most of the guys that are on that roster right now.
The work Georgetown did in the transfer portal intrigues me because in terms of looking at what they got and how much it contributes to them, like having a winning season this year, I don't know that they quite did enough maybe to jump up in the top half of the Big East or whatever. But looking at each individual piece, they're guys I like. They're guys I think can help at the Division I level. I'm under the assumption that Harvard guard Malik Mack, who you've talked about already, and TCU forward Micah Peavy are the guys that are going to make the biggest impacts. Which out of those two would you expect to make a bigger impact?
Well, it's interesting. I think we'll see Mack make a greater impact at the offensive end. I think Peavy, as somebody who played for Jamie Dixon, defense is essentially mandatory, playing for Jamie Dixon, that he's going to have an impact at that end of the floor. Because, watching Georgetown last year, and really, let's face it, watching Georgetown for the last 8 years, or 7 years, I should say, has been a study in what happens when you don't really care about defense. And, a stat that I love, I looked up last season, and it's now, I updated it yesterday, because I think I'd looked it up in late February. Georgetown has lost its last 55 games when it scored 65 points or less. The last time they won a game when they scored 65 or less was on the first day of the Maui Invitational in 2016, when John Thompson III was still the coach.
Wow.
Okay.
That's pretty good.
So they simply did not play defense under Patrick Ewing at all. And then last year, I think that might have been more than the losing, the simple inability to defend. And I can't tell you the number of times Ed Cooley talked about defense being about a want and a will and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's like, you guys, like, I felt last year, there was certainly some times where they didn't want to play defense, but for the most part, it was that they were incapable of playing defense. At some point, you're just not good enough. And that's what last year's collection of guys was just, they just weren't good enough. And so I think having Peavy as sort of a linchpin there at the defensive end is really going to mean a lot to them. I don't know if they suddenly go to being an above average defense, whether nationally or even in the Big East. But I expect them to be better. And I don't think that that's an unfair expectation for anybody that has watched them just kind of, not hang their hat at that end of the floor, let's say, for the last several years.
I was a little surprised to see Kentucky transfer Jordan Burks get the start in the Virginia scrimmage. What have you heard on the Kentucky transfers so far this preseason?
The interesting thing, and I'm going to throw Curtis Williams Jr. in here too, just because I feel like there's a little bit of yin and yang there, right? Like, Burks was a guy that didn't play much on a good team. CJ Williams was a guy who played 20 minutes a game on a horrible team. And so, how far along are both of those guys? Like, is one of those guys better off because he was around a lot of winning last season, or is one of those guys further along because he happened to play a lot more? I know that there's certainly some bullishness on what Burks can bring to them from an athleticism standpoint. So, the crazy thing is you look at this roster and there's two upperclassmen on the entire roster. There's Epps and there's Peavy. And so you have all of these young dudes, and it's kind of a jump ball. I mean, you have guys that you think are going to play a pretty big role. We've talked about Mack and we've talked about Sorber, and I think you kind of figure that a guy like a Fielder figures in there somewhere, just because, it almost makes last year feel even worse. If you're Georgetown, if you're not developing him and getting something out of that. But I do think that they are high on Burks, and I think he's one of those guys that if he comes in, on the higher end of the projection, that's going to help them a lot and get them a lot closer. I think that might be as big a wild card as they have on this roster, because there just wasn't much of a track record, but at the same time, he wasn't ending up at Kentucky unless there was a fair bit of talent there.
You've already talked a little bit about Thomas Sorber, but I want to go back to him because when I look at this and I look at the box score from the Virginia scrimmage, and he played as much as anybody did, and he equipped himself very well in that game. Why are they so high on him? Why is he special? Because it feels like in this day and age, it's hard to come in, especially as a big man, and make an impact as a freshman when you're going up against 24, 25-year-olds that have transferred multiple times, been in multiple systems. Why is he able to do that, or why do they think he can?
Well, I think some of it is kind of what I was describing earlier, which is that he moves well. Like, there's a smoothness to his game, a maturity to his game. They're also very high on his coachability and his willingness to kind of figure things out. One of the things that I know that they probably haven't entirely gone to yet, but are optimistic about, is his passing ability as well. And so to be able to have a big man that can do that and suddenly create some opportunities for those guards. And it's interesting because they have smaller guards than you think of when you think of Ed Cooley teams over the years. Epps and Mack aren't quite as big, which actually another guy I should probably bring up here Kayvon Mulready is a guy that I think you are going to see a fair bit of as well in that backcourt.
Another freshman.
And a freshman, yes.
Yeah.
Another freshman. And a guy that I think they see as somebody that we might even have the ability to handle the ball a little bit and create more opportunities for Mac and for Epps to not necessarily, have to have one of them with their ball in their hands all the time. I think that in all likelihood, those are your two primary ball handlers. But Mulready is a guy that they are clearly pretty high on as well, and think can make an impact both short term and especially long term.
Yeah, when they asked Jaden Epps at Big East Media Day during the little TV spot interview about this team and what's different about it, the first thing he brought up was the freshmen. He said, our freshmen are really good. So that kind of got me going, thinking, oh, okay, I'm ready to see these young guys now for Georgetown, see what they can do. Looking at the Virginia box score, which, again, we don't have full information from all of this stuff, and who knows what will happen when the regular season actually tips off. But they started Malik Mack, Jaden Epps, Micah Peavy, Jordan Burks, and Thomas Sorber in that scrimmage. Do you think that's what they're likely to stick with for the first game? And if not, or even if so, is there another guy that you could see maybe sneaking into that rotation?
That sounds about right. Like, I mean, you're sitting there and you're trying not to go too overboard on the freshman right out of the chute. And so, I think you look at that and you have your two older guys in Epps and Peavy in there. Malik Mack didn't come to come off the bench by any stretch of the imagination. Burks obviously is a talent, and they think very highly of Sorber. So, I think those are probably, I don't know if those are going to ultimately be your 5 top minutes guys if you're Georgetown, but I certainly think that that's kind of the core group that they're looking at among a handful of other guys. But those guys in particular, I think, we mentioned Curtis Williams, we mentioned Mulready, we mentioned Fielder. Would not be surprised if that's a group that you see, those 8 kind of being key guys right out of the chute for them. And then maybe some of the other freshmen fill in as they go further along. We've
talked a lot of specifics here, but just general terms, can you give me maybe strength, weakness for this team?
Because it's so new, like, I mean, do you really know, right? Like, I think, that they're going to have 2 legitimate backcourt scorers, which is a step forward for them. I think that they'll be better on defense, if only because they can't be much worse. So, I think they'll be better. I don't know if that translates to much more than a couple more wins along the way. But I also think that, as we kind of started off with, that they'll have a little bit more hope, I think, assuming that everybody stays healthy and there isn't some sort of mass defection or something, which you normally, 5 years ago, even you probably wouldn't have said anything about. But now you never know, right? Like, you got to almost throw out that possibility. But I think that they believe that they have kind of, a foundational class that they're going to work with here, and that this is a group that they can largely retain over the long haul if things go well in terms of making improvement, guys making improvement behind the scenes, and also just feeling like they're moving things in the right direction, as opposed to just, frankly, the last month and a half, 2 months of last season was, just sort of checking the box and moving on to the next game, because it was clear that season wasn't going to be any different than the 2 previous that closed out the Patrick Ewing years.
Awesome stuff, Patrick. I really appreciate you doing this. I know it's a busy time of the year for you, but this was great stuff. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Another Big East preview in the books. That's Patrick Stevens. You can follow him on Twitter. It's D1S Course or D1's Course. How do you say
Discourse.
That? Discourse. Okay. But it's a number 1 in there.
It
right?
is.
Yes.
It is.
Okay. So D, the number 1, and then spell out Discourse from there, and you'll find him on Twitter. All right. Thank you, guys.